Hello and welcome to another episode of Gender Stories. As ever, and if you listen to my podcast, I am excited because I always have the best guests. And today I am thrilled to be interviewing Justine Mastin, who is an LMFT, so a fellow marriage and family therapist and colleague. We've been on a board together. I love Justine. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And as well as being an awesome human being, she's a pop culture psychology expert and so much more. She literally wrote the book on Therapeutic Fanfiction, and also I've seen her present on this topic, and she's magnificent. But the book is Starship Therapise, using Therapeutic Fanfiction to rewrite your life. And she's also offers support to therapists and healers in her more recent book, The Grieving Therapist, Caring for Yourselves and Your Client when it feels like the end of the world, which is pretty much every day as far as I'm concerned nowadays. And if you're watching the podcast, you can see the cover of The Grieving Therapist. I lent Starship Therapise, and so I don't have it with me. Sorry about that. That's how great it is. I lent it out, but both books are really wonderful. And more than that, Justine also has two podcasts. YogaQuest is the fearless leader of YogaQuest. You do so many things. And she's also proud to nurture future therapists as an AMFT approved supervisor and educator, and as a TEDx talk. And don't worry, dear listeners, I'm putting all of these links in the episode description so you can go check out the million things that Justine does. So welcome, Justine. So
thank
good to have
you
you
so
here.
much for having me, and thank you for that lovely intro. Yes, sometimes when I hear it all recited back to me, I think maybe I need to slow my roll.
I know that feeling. So as a fellow overdoer, not that I'm saying you're overdoing it, but maybe I was looking at your website and I was like, whoa, how do you even find time to do all those things?
Yeah, I just do. Although the longer answer is that I have wonderful people around me who support me. And, for both of the books, Starship Therapise and The Grieving Therapist, I have a co-author who also happens to be my very best friend in the world, who is also a licensed marriage and family therapist, Larissa Agarski. I would never want to write alone.
I know that feeling. I wrote like one book alone, and all my other books are co-authored for a reason with my writing partner, MJ, who is also one of my closest people. So I completely understand how important it is to have people you collaborate with and who support you and that you can do things with. It's just, yes, none of us do those things alone or outside of community, I don't think. Ready. So let's start from Starship Therapise, right? Because that's how I first became aware of you.
Oh, is it? Yes. That's always fun to find out how people heard about me.
I know, right? I was like, you didn't know this, but because we never talked about this. But that's how I became aware of kind of you and your work. And I was so excited because I also have a lot of geeky clients, and it was so wonderful to see another therapist who you not only work with geeky community, but you also provide a lot of tools to therapists on kind of how to use fanfiction, how to use kind of fandom to connect with clients in a therapeutic manner. And so one of the things I'm curious about, given that this is Gender Stories, is that in my experience, and it could be just because I'm old, I don't know, I'm like in my 50s, but fandom communities haven't always been the most welcoming in terms of any gender who's basically not a cis white man, or any people who are racialized, not white, or disabled folks. And of course there are exceptions like WISCON, which is one of my most beloved cons, that is like a science fiction and fantasy convention that's like a feminist social justice focused one. The kind of broader kind of geeky community has had its challenges, let's say, to be Midwestern around kind of differences and diversity and anything that deviates from kind of the stereotypical fan, let's call it, who's like usually a cis white straight man. And it's you nodding. So, okay, this is... So what has your experience been just being part of geek community? Let's just start from there, maybe.
Yeah. When I first got interested in pop culture stories, this was before the internet was the way the internet is, right? I'm in my 40s. And so when I was coming up, like, I guess there was internet, but I was not savvy enough to be anywhere near that. We didn't have a computer in our home until... Anyway, point being, I had no idea that other people liked the stuff I liked, or that they felt about it the way I felt about it. Because it's not just that I loved Twin Peaks, it's that Twin Peaks really meant something to me.
Yes.
Like deeply, profoundly meant something to me. And the fact that Agent Dale Cooper said that he didn't know where we were going, but he was sure it would be a place both wonderful and strange. And as a strange young person who didn't understand my strangeness yet, and that strangeness was always presented as bad, having this person that I felt deeply connected to say both wonderful and strange was so like profoundly meaningful for me. But I didn't know how to tell anybody that. Luckily, I mean, my parents were both story lovers. They were both writers and editors, and story was very welcome in our home. There were always stories, and it was totally valid to engage with them. And also, there wasn't exactly a community that I could go to and be like, so everybody loves Dale Cooper, right? And we're all giving ourselves a gift every day. And so my exposure was I was in theater when I was young. And so I found some folks in the theater community who were also embedded in stories. But again, just didn't know how to have those conversations about the deepness and the richness. And it really wasn't until maybe 2010. I had just trained to be a yoga teacher. And I went to my first pop culture convention that same year. And the timing was wild, but it just happened to be what it happened to be. And I looked around and thought, I haven't felt quite at home in the yoga community. And I think it's because this community is what I want. Could I merge wellness and these stories that are profoundly meaningful to me? And the answer was, you can if you want to, and you put a lot of time and effort into it. And so I started creating spaces. So that's a very long, winding story. And then, I've made my way into many pop culture spaces now where I've had a variety of experiences. There's spaces that are very welcoming. There are spaces that are And historically, fandom spaces have not been welcoming to folks who are outside of, cis, het, white dudes. And there was sort of a movement during Star Trek.
Yep.
The original series, right? When women started writing fan fiction.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's like, I have so many feelings. I was like, is it okay if I jump in?
Yes, please, yes, come in. Otherwise, I will just monologue. Because I'm a Kirk.
Wonderful. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, that's great. I was sitting back. I was like, go, Justine, you can have the whole hour. Just keep talking. I'm here with you. I'm going on this journey of young Justine, finding, kind of Twin Peaks and then finding community. Yeah. It's like, I'm here for the monologue, but I will ask questions because my brain is pinging in 10 different directions, which is there is this piece where even kind of this feeling, right? I want to share this with other people, right? And one of the things that I realized that was a gift for me growing up was that there wasn't so much this kind of geeky label if you were into anime, manga, or comic books. In Italy in the 70s and 80s, it seemed to be pretty common, or maybe it was just that was so oblivious that I didn't realize that made me different. I don't know. It could go either way, but it's you could find those things at the newsstand, and everybody else watched the same kind of shows, and really anime was just so big in Italy in the 70s and 80s. And so when I moved to kind of the UK at first and then the US back in 2008, just realizing that there were all these communities that were physical communities, right? And already connected online, live the days of live journal.
Yeah,
that really
live
ages me,
journal.
right? A live journal where we could talk about, like, did you watch this episode? Did it touch your heart in this ways, right? So there's kind of this piece about cultural context, right? What do we label as like other or a specific interest or a niche? And then there is this piece of like, who is this content for? Who is it created? Who consumes it, right? But then there's this other piece about wellness and the healing we find through stories, right? So I'm like, oh, there are like 3 pieces, like each one of them could be a whole episode, quite frankly. So I'll leave it to you to pick up like which piece you want to talk about. But really, we could go in any direction. I mean, maybe I guess we should go the wellness direction because we're both therapists, but we could go in other directions too. How are you feeling about it?
I think the wellness is embedded in whatever direction we go, right? Because stories are so inherently healing. So wherever we go, healing will follow.
Oh my God, I love that. I feel like that should be on a t-shirt. Wherever we go, healing will follow. The final frontier.
Frontier. That's right. Boldly going into therapy.
Going. Exactly. Well, and I think that's the thing. I think, you said, I love that you talked about the wonderful and strange piece, right? And Twin Peaks is not my fandom, but I've been in fandom spaces enough that I feel like I've absorbed some of the Twin Peaks wisdom, by affinity. But this idea that kind of, I think a lot of us who feel maybe different or other often find ourselves in science fiction, in fantasy. I don't think it's an accident. I've talked about it even with like trans authors who've been on the show, right? How many trans and queer folks are really into science fiction and fantasy, shape shifting, of course, or, even Octavia Butler, kind of Lily's Brood, the beautiful and strange, gender expansive interspecies love, and creation and all of it, all the complex themes of that trilogy, right? It's like, I think there is something that draws us when we feel like we don't fit the dominant culture to those stories that are maybe outside of the current paradigm. Is that been your experience as well? And
yeah, absolutely. I was on Minnesota Public Radio just a few weeks ago and talking about parasocial relationships.
Yes.
And for any of your listeners or watchers who aren't familiar with that concept, parasocial relationships are the one-sided relationships that we have with fandom characters. So that could be fictional characters, that could be celebrities whom we've never met. It could be historical characters, and I call them fandom attachments because it's all about attachment. And we are attachment-seeking creatures by nature. And if we aren't finding the community that we're looking for, if we aren't seeing ourselves represented in other stories, we're going to gravitate towards that which is calling to us, that we can attach to. And of course we want to attach to, something that feels aligned. And for folks who are outside the mainstream, often that is fantasy and sci-fi, because those folks are thinking outside the cultural paradigm. And they're sometimes not doing a great job. I mean, I love the television series Supernatural. I'm a big Supernatural fan. And they haven't done great with thinking outside the box. But their fans are great at thinking outside the box.
Which I think is where the fan fiction comes in, right? Sometimes there's fan fiction that I love even more than the original stories in a lot of ways. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and, I think of a character like Dean Winchester. Jensen Ackles has said over and over again that he plays Dean as a heterosexual dude. That is not what I observe when I watch the show and see his behavior and eye contact and body movement. And, I'm like, as a bi, I am seeing myself reflected in you, sir. And it's fine if that's not how you plan to play it, but that's how I'm receiving it. And I'm connecting to you because I am receiving that. And so my headcanon, my personal fan fiction is, Dean, you are bisexual. And that means that I feel like I can connect to you better.
And that's the beauty, I think, and the wellness and the healing of stories, right? Is who
Mm-hmm.
do we connect to and why, and we might even
Yep.
connect to characters that are so different from us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Aliens or even non-humans or shapeshifters, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
like, how do we find that kind of heart connection that helps us understand ourselves? Or
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's also that comfort thing. Recently, I've been rewatching Jessica Jones, and I'm like, why am I watching this show? There is so much trauma and
So
PTSD
much.
and intergenerational, like, family dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what am I doing? But then I was watching season 2, and I'm like, oh, there it is. There is this piece where she's just reflecting, right? And she
Mm-hmm.
talks about, I'm not like you, with Kilgrave, and I'm not like
Mm-hmm.
you, her mom. I don't think it's been out for a while, so I
Yeah,
don't
it's
think
you
that's a
can't.
spoiler.
I don't think you can spoiler anyone. There were also comics.
Yeah, there were also comics for a long time before Marvel picked them up
Yeah.
in point. I was like, so I don't think it's a spoiler, but I'm always like so careful. But there is this piece where she's like, no, I can't control myself, right? So I'm more powerful than you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of taking your power back, taking your agency. And I
Yep.
think that sometimes, growing up, like when you feel like you don't have agency, either because maybe you are kind of, you present or brought up feminine in the world, or
Mm-hmm.
you feel like you don't have power in some other way, or experience trauma, right? Those stories help us make sense, right? In a way, she
Mm-hmm.
represents the side of me that wishes I could just be an asshole and let all my rage out. The way
Yeah.
she does, right? And kind of, she has a very different management strategy.
Mm-hmm.
She's not a people pleaser. I am. But there's something satisfying, I think, to see the side of,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of in me, but doesn't get expressed because the people pleaser side always wins, right? But to see this character almost embody this anger, rage, isolation,
Mm-hmm.
difficulties with intimacy, that any of us who experience trauma understand what that feels like. Does that make sense? So there's
Yeah.
just
Oh,
this intersection that's so beautiful.
absolutely. And what was coming up for me as you were talking, I was thinking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer,
Yes.
which came out my final year of high school. And I remember just thinking, where was this?
Yes.
Where was this? I needed this. And
Mm-hmm.
I became a Buffy devotee, start to finish. And we could have a whole conversation about creators and how they disappoint us. And
Mm-hmm.
that is a story for another time. Um, there's a lot to be said about creators and how they disappoint us. But the character of Buffy was
Absolutely.
so meaningful to me in a similar way to what you're saying with Jessica Jones. It's like, okay, so you're telling me that a girl can be powerful
Yes.
and stylish and athletic and soft and complicated and funny and all these things. Whoa. Because when I was coming up as a teenager in the 90s, everything was just this like polarization. You are either this or that. You can't be two things.
Mm-hmm.
Pick a lane. You're going to be a theater nerd. You're not going to be athletic. They're like, you
Yes.
can do dance. That's fine. But you're not athletic. Let's just be clear about that. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to be soft. You're choosing a soft lane. And I'm like, but I'm actually like kind of soft butch, although I don't have that language yet. But I have a chain wallet because I know that feels right somehow, but it's not okay for me to be those many things. And here was Buffy coming in saying, no, you can be all those things and have
Absolutely.
community.
And of community. That's the other piece,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there is this piece about community, even surrogate parental figures with Giles. I'm a big
Mm-hmm.
Buffy fan too. And yes, all our favorites are problematic by and large. We can
Yep.
absolutely, we could talk about that like for the whole episode.
Mm.
Yeah, we almost called our oldest child Joss or Anyanka. So, before we knew
Oh,
better, all our favorites are problematic. This was a long
yeah.
time ago, 2 decades ago, and a little bit more actually now, from when I was kind of just dating. But yeah, that's like, I think there is something in that. And the whole arc also at the end with like sharing the power, right? That this is not
Yes.
about being exceptional or individually
Mm-hmm.
exceptional, right? That actually you cannot do this in isolation. And that's what I love
Mm-hmm.
about Buffy as well. And that's like finding different pieces in different fandoms, right? With
Mm-hmm.
Buffy, I always feel it's an ensemble piece. I think about some of those beautiful shots where they like
Mm-hmm.
move as a group, right?
Yeah.
Like for especially like in the musical episode, there's some
Mm-hmm.
great shot of
Oh,
all
Once
of
More with
them.
Feeling has amazing shots of the whole. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. Like it's very much an ensemble piece where I think about,
Mm-hmm.
Jessica Jones, where yeah, she has allies, but she's pushing people away. Right? It's different
Mm-hmm.
parts of ourselves, and in a way, or different
Yeah.
people that can
Mm-hmm.
relate to different parts. And I love that what you said about like, you can be complex, you can be many
Mm-hmm.
things in a world that often wants us to be very this or that. You're either kind of smart, but you can't be pretty if you're a girl. You can be
Mm-hmm.
soft if you're a girl, but you can't be hard, right? You can be really good at math, but then that means you're not supposed to care about what you look like or what, like. And even as a
Yeah.
parent, I see that it breaks my heart that,
Mm-hmm.
my kid was like in her early 20s is still dealing with some of that misogyny that's just like kind of not going away, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's so interesting that we can make sense of ourselves through those stories while then also having to deal with the kind of relating within fandom with folks who are also perpetuating some of the stories. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
do your
Oh.
clients ever talk about that? I mean, obviously
Mm-hmm.
not disclosing any
No.
personal information,
Mm-hmm.
but like this theme of like, oh, this is my community, but also this community sometimes is misogynistic or transphobic
Mm-hmm.
or racist and or all of the above, or queerphobic, and it hurts me in this ways
Mm-hmm.
because this is where I should feel like I belong, and yet I also feel
Yeah.
like sometimes I don't belong. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and I can speak to actually having those conversations in fandom spaces
Yes.
because for the past 10 years or so, I've been going to pop culture conventions and talking about wellness, whether it's, moving our bodies or self care or mental
Mm-hmm.
health. And I'll talk about the power of community. And, someone inevitably will raise their hand and say, well, what if your community is toxic?
Surprise.
Yeah. Right. And so I obviously the answer is it depends. But if we're talking about, fandom spaces like the internet, sure, there are going to be some forums that are going to be different than other ones. And to my mind, it's in the same way that we acknowledge that we love Aunt Doris as a human and we reject her beliefs about certain groups of people. We can accept that these other people love Supernatural and let go of their belief system that doesn't match with ours. And that's okay because we're all allowed to have that fan fiction. And if they're trying to put that on us and say we're bad or that we're wrong, thank you so much. Next.
Absolutely. And find your people who are going to share
Mm-hmm.
that, right? Because it's like, and it's so interesting because even, and not just with fan fiction, but also with reimagining of existing material. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking about Bridgerton in some ways as its own fandom, right? I love that
Yep.
almost everything can be a fandom at this point.
Yep.
And there's been so much outrage about changing the gender of some of the characters to so that
Mm-hmm.
it's more queer in the TV series than it was in the books, even though the book's author was like, this is cool with me. But, some people were having feelings and I try not to engage. But sometimes I can't resist when it's late at night and I can't sleep. I'm like, let me put this little comment,
Well, let me just get in a
Exactly.
fight.
let me just get into an internet fight for 5 minutes, And I try always to I'm like, well, I'm trying to educate and see if there's an opening, right? And sometimes
Yep.
there is an opening actually. Because I
Sure.
always try to approach with I'm curious, or hey, did you have this piece of information? Because
Mm-hmm.
somebody was like, and also it's fascinating that it was about queerness, but they managed to make it about gender because of the change in gender from the book to the TV series.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So it became this whole transphobic like sloof of comments about, there's only two genders. Why do they have to change the gender of the character? And I was like, well, first of all, like, there's not even like there's a trans person in Bridgerton right now. So,
not that we are aware of.
Not that we know, at least. Not that it has been revealed. I don't know. Yeah. I haven't read the books, so I'm only watching the TV series, right? But I was like, that actually, because they were like nature, this male and female in nature. I was like, oh, actually, nature is much more expansive than that.
What are you
happy to share
about?
some resources. Exactly, and happy to share some resources if you want, right? And for me, sometimes pushing back is also like, well, 98% probability is that this person is not going to be open to what I'm saying. But there is this piece about like other people in the comment also going, oh, hang on, somebody else gets it. Somebody else is pushing back. Maybe when I don't have the capacity to do that, right? Because I think that matters. When you do a panel and there is that person who stands up and go, but what about, like there's probably another like 50 people, depending on the convention, right? Was sitting there thinking the same thing. And so how do you feel like the people find kind of spaces within spaces to take care of themselves? So kind of those spaces where maybe the larger fandom, that's, it's complicated. And like you said, it's like you just leave Andorras alone, or maybe you have one mild argument over a cup of tea and then kind of let it go, right? When you feel like it. But then how do you find the space, the smaller space within the larger space where you can feel supported and connected and heard?
Yeah. So my invitation to folks, whether it's online or in person, is go into spaces where folks are similar to you, which is like, well, how do I find them? If you're going to a convention, if you are a queer person, look for the header that says this is a panel about queer characters or by, queer creators, or, the industry has gotten, well, not the industry, the conversations at pop culture events and some other satellite locations have been so much more welcoming of disability rights and transgender rights, and bringing in creators with those identities to talk about their own work and their own experience. And so keep your eyes out for that. And then go talk to the presenters. They really do want to talk to you. Say hi to the person sitting next to you, because clearly you have at least something in common, which is you were interested enough in this panel to make time for it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the room has the same identities, but there are people in the room with the same values.
Yes.
For the most part. There is typically at least a couple of folks that are just going to show up to hate watch and maybe hate comment, because that's the world that we live in. But the majority of people are there earnestly wanting to make connections, wanting to learn more, also wanting to be in community. And if you turn to your neighbor and say, hey, I'm Justine, nice to meet you, they will also introduce themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that then it's like, as well as those parasocial relationships, then you're creating some genuine community connection, hopefully, especially if you go to the same event over and over, right? And that can be really scary. I know the relationships that we have with characters, right? We're asking, connecting with our fellow humans, even if we have things in common, there's always like the danger of like rejection or being hurt or feeling, right? And I think that's often what people struggle with. I wonder if you've seen any example of spaces where there is an intentionality around enabling people to connect, right? Because it can be hard for people to connect. And I think, I don't know, maybe it's just me or people I know, but for a lot of us, we're like neurospicy or different in other ways in fandom spaces. It can be a little intimidating. And so maybe even YogaQuest, which is one of the spaces you've created and curated and lead. And I can definitely think of examples, but what do you see those spaces do? Or like I said, maybe you can want to talk about your own experience of creating that kind of space.
Yeah. I mean, I created YogaQuest exactly for the reasons that you're saying, is that I went to that convention and looked around and thought, how come we aren't talking about how healing all of this is? And it's inherently healing, but we could also bring in some additional self-care stuff. Like we're allowed to move our bodies, and no matter our size or ability. And at the time, that was a pretty radical thing to be saying in yoga spaces too.
Yes, yes, that's true.
And I've always been a little bit of a rabble rouser, so I was like, well, I don't see this space anywhere. I'll just make it.
Yeah.
And just sort of reached out to, here in the Twin Cities, there's a group called the Geek Partnership Society. And I discovered that they had a fitness branch, or what was it called? Geek Physique is what it was called.
That's amazing.
It may still exist. But I reached out to their organizer. So it's something already existed, right? And I reached out and said, hey, I'm a yoga teacher. I'm a nerd. I have this idea. It might flop. But like, could I come over to your warehouse and try it out? And they wanted to meet me to vet me, which,
of course,
totally fair. I want to make sure I wasn't some, hardcore cheerleader girl who was gonna be on everybody
for something.
Yeah, exactly. Like I was coming in to bully everybody.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm pretty, like, I'm a pretty traditional yogi looker, or very much was at the time. The petite blonde woman. But after talking for a bit, it's like, okay, you're cool.
You might be petite and blonde, but you're one of us.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, all right.
Just like Buffy. No.
Just like Buffy.
Just like Buffy.
It's you can be many things at once.
Right.
But I understood it. And I was just very intentional that I wanted this to be as welcoming as possible. And so I was really explicit when people came in to give permission. Like, if we're doing a pose you don't like, I'll give some options. If you don't like any of those, you don't have to do anything I'm saying. Because guess what, friends? You are autonomous human beings who get to decide what to do with your minds and bodies.
What?
And truly,
right.
It was mind-blowing for people. And I started getting more and more traction because people were like, all right, so this little lady isn't going to be mean to me. And she's going to tell me that I deserve and am worth the effort to take care of myself. Wow. And I'm not the only person who was doing this. It was sort of part of a zeitgeist I noticed at the time. Yes. And there's some fitness orgs that are still going. My friend at Geek Girl Strong, who does an online business mostly, but I think she's in Philly. She was in New York. But I started going to conventions and teaching yoga, and people were like, wow. I just, I've never been given permission like this before. And so my invitation to folks, and I know it's scary. I do. I know it's scary. If you don't see the thing that you need or want, you're allowed to make it. And that's how we got all of the awesome stories that we love so much, is that people didn't see the story they needed, and so they made it.
Absolutely. And so much of fan fiction is that, right? Also, people writing them ourselves in the stories, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I don't see the queerness, so there is subtext about the queerness. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna make that subtext text, right? Or I'm gonna imagine doing something different with this canon that makes me feel more included.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And then sometimes as we do that and become more involved in community, we might also find, oh, hang on a minute, there are all these other stories that are maybe not as mainstream, but actually
Mm-hmm.
where I can see myself, I can see my racialized identity or my gender or my queerness or my disability, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
beautiful kind of to see that there's now more opportunities for people to also just get those stories out in the world because of the
Yes.
internet. Mm-hmm.
Well, and as you're talking about this, I'm thinking of, when you ask, like, how do you find your people? There
Mm-hmm.
are stories that
Yes.
exist that are doing good work, like
Mm-hmm.
Our Flag Means Death.
Oh my God. I love that show so much. I just watched it again for the third time. So yes, let's talk about that.
Right? And for folks who aren't familiar, it's also lovingly known as the Gay Pirate Show.
Mhm.
Uh, like Taika Waititi and Rhys Darby as Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, on the
Yes.
high seas, and they are canonically a
Oh yeah.
couple.
Yeah. It's not subtext. It's like it's text, right? And
It's
I love,
text.
and it's not just that they're canonically a couple. They're also like kind of like messed up by their family of origin, so there is
Yes.
some trauma. I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of our flag mean stuff is also about what does family means and what does it mean to find queer
Yes.
family. It's very
Mm-hmm.
much about queer family. And there are lots of queer stories where people are not necessarily looking the way we expect them to look. So for me, as I struggle with aging, quite frankly,
Mm-hmm.
to see like a same gender story of two older men was like it's very healing, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
especially like there's a lot of kind of ageism in terms of kind of youth worship in gay male community in my experience, right? And there's a
Sure.
lot of jokes about by the time you turn 30 you might as well be dead, like I mean, and especially somebody who grew up like during the AIDS crisis. I was like, yeah, a
Right.
lot of our people did die
They
before
did.
they,
Yeah.
like I
Mm-hmm.
went to the Keith Haring exhibit at the Walker, and I was just like crying, thinking about how much more he could have done, right? If he lived
Mm-hmm.
longer, he died like in his 30s. So many amazing people died in their
Mm-hmm.
30s, you know, people who would have been my elders now,
Right.
right? Like we lost so many elders. And so to see a story like Our Flag Means Death with two older
Mm-hmm.
men, it's not just the queerness, it's also like they're older, the characters are complicated, they're
Yeah.
messy, they're dealing with PTSD and trauma
Mm-hmm.
and finding themselves in a world that's like also systemically complex in terms of
Mm-hmm.
class and gender. And yeah, it's such a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What did you think of Jim?
I love Jim, and I love how Jim is handled. That's the other piece, right? There is this like
Mm-hmm.
non-binary actor playing this character when
Mm-hmm.
there is like the gender reveal, so to speak, that this
Mm-hmm.
person who we perceive as a man at the beginning is actually maybe not a man.
Mm-hmm.
Where there is this piece where people are confused and they just go, it's just Jim. And everybody is just like, oh, okay. Or when they meet the
Mm-hmm.
person who kind of brought them up basically after their um, family dies, they're like, it's just Jim now. And the person is just like, yeah, the nun just goes into Jim and they just seamlessly, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's even not a thing. And I loved it. I loved it
Yeah.
because it wasn't, the emphasis is not on that piece of the story.
Mm-hmm.
They're just a character. Same as in the latest season of Doctor Who. There's been a lot of kind of
Oh,
stuff
I'm
around.
not I'm
Oh,
not
you're
caught
not.
up, but
But
but I do know all of the buzz. Yes.
yeah, there's just some good. I will not do any spoilers because lots of people haven't caught up.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I used to have a favorite doctor. Now I have a new favorite doctor.
Okay.
And Cody's amazing as a new doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But there are kind of just beautiful day that moment and
Mm-hmm.
disability justice stuff that's very subtle. It's just there. Without
Yeah.
having to be explained or without having to be the focus of the story. And I love
Mm-hmm.
when that happens. What about you? What did you like a lot
Yeah.
about Our Flag Means Death? What was the thing that
Oh,
got to you the most?
yeah. I mean, there were so many things. The focus on found family
Mm-hmm.
was just spoke to my heart so much. And I've been on a few panels about Our Flag Means Death, and why it's so revolutionary, and
Mm-hmm.
why it has such a strong fan base, many of whom are queer folks, disabled folks, folks of various marginalized identities. Like, well, I think to the scene where they're making flags,
Yes.
and they're going to vote on which one is the best flag, and then they will fly the best flag, and they fly everybody's flag.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I was 100% bought in, because I was like, they get it. We're all important. We all deserve to have our flag flown.
That is so beautiful. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's maybe a good segue, because I'm aware of time. I feel like I could talk to you for like the whole day, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
we'll just have to have another episode. But for now, maybe that's a good segue to talk about the grieving therapist. Because when I first saw that you had another book coming out before
Mm-hmm.
it came out, when it was like pre-order, I
Yeah.
was like, well, that's fascinating that you went from like fan fiction and using fan fiction therapeutically to, something like the grieving therapist, which is
Mm-hmm.
really about, caring for yourself as a therapist and a healer during this time of like, climate crisis, ongoing genocides,
Mm-hmm.
the increase of global fascism. I mean, take your
Yep.
pick,
Just
really.
everything. Climate
Everything. Just,
crisis.
the other day I was talking to my therapist and I was like, I don't know if I'm like depressed or if this is a good reaction to what's happening in the world or if it's perimenopause or I don't even know anymore. Or maybe a side effect of this medication. I honestly don't know. I'm kind of sitting with it with curiosity, right? There's a lot to be depressed about. And not in,
Yes.
like, I feel like it's a reasonable response to the world right
Mm-hmm.
now. But I was curious. I'm like, how did we go from like fun fiction to the grieving therapist? And,
Mm-hmm.
I made sense of it once I read the book, but I'm curious about from your point of view, if it felt like a change in trajectory or not so much, or if it felt just like a continuation of your story in some way.
Yeah. Well, so something that I talk to my students about a lot is the importance of understanding historical context.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand how I went from Starship Therapise to the grieving therapist requires historical context.
Fair.
Larissa and I had been pitching Starship Therapise for a long time. We were finally able to find the most wonderful editor and that picked us up and brought us into North Atlantic Books. And we were so excited. 3 months later, the pandemic happened. We wrote the entirety of Starship Therapise during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So this mostly quite lighthearted, foray
Yeah.
into play and story was written during some of the most depressing times in our lives.
Yeah.
And we didn't get to do any of the things that we thought we were going to get to do. Like when we sold Starship Therapise, the intention was we're going to be at Comic-Con, we're going to be at smaller pop culture conventions, we're going to do all this stuff to release the book and be in all these public spaces and all these convention fandom spaces. The world was shut down for years.
Mm-hmm.
And so the grieving therapist came out of the literal grief we experienced from having to let go of our dream of what it was going to be, to be authors, to release a book, to be therapists, to be humans in this world. There was so much grieving. It was so awful. And when our wonderful editor Shayna came to us and said, "Hey, what do you want to write next?" Larissa and I sat down, we wrote out a bunch of ideas, and I was like, I think it'd be really important for us to write about the grief we experienced. Yeah. Which is very funny if you know me and Larissa, because historically I am a Kirk. I am I am the boisterous bravado, let's just get in the ship and fly. And she's very Spock. She wants to sit and consider, but she also tends to be the holder of emotions for us. And so me saying, let's talk about grief, she's like,
what is happening?
Yeah, what is happening? But from her Spock mind, she was playing it out and going, this is going to be really painful and hard. And I don't want to do that. And my Kirkiness is like, we already felt the pain, Larissa. We're just writing about it.
Yeah.
See, it's not like we're going to feel it again.
I mean, and you might, but that's part of the process, right? If
yeah. I mean,
there.
The funny thing is, oh boy, did we feel it. Yeah. But Shayna was so excited about this book, was like, yeah, let's do it. And we spent 9 months reliving grief and stepping into all of these grieving spaces. And I got COVID, which turned into long COVID. And it had major psychological impact on me, as well as, bodily impact. And I made some major self-discoveries during that time. So even though it seems like how is The Grieving Therapist the spiritual sequel to Starship Therapise? It was what came next.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which to me makes complete sense in terms of timing. I was like, oh yes, this is so, this is so essential actually in terms of where we are. And I think what comes to mind as you were talking was also how we find ourselves through writing stories as well as listening and consuming stories, right? Which is part, just like fan fiction, but we also, when we write nonfiction, we're also making sense of our own stories. And so I love how you described that beautiful arc of actually like, there was all this excitement and then life had other plans, which actually often is at the heart of many of the stories we love, right?
Yep.
We are on one path and life has other plan and send us on this like very different quest, and sometimes the side quest becomes the main quest.
Yeah. Well, and we did get to still write some fanfic. We got to fanfic some of our favorite theorists from a variety of realms into animal spirits that were wandering through this sort of fantastical land that we created. And if you haven't read the book Friends at Home, I promise it all connects and makes sense.
Yes. It does all make sense if you read the book. Absolutely. Well, and in a way, I also do see the spirit of what you're doing with YogaQuest in this book, right? It's like this connection of like, how can stories help us make sense, right? When we bring stories into movement through YogaQuest, right? When we bring our stories into fandom, when we bring story and narrative into our emotion, our grief, right? We need to make sense. We need stories and we need allies, right? Whether it's animal allies or other characters or fantastic allies of some kind, right? We need to feel that we're not alone, right? Like kind of almost goes back to the beginning of this interview when you were like, oh, Twin Peaks. And now who do I share with? Where are my people who are going to get as excited as I am about this, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. I love that. Well, I feel like I could go on and on talking about all of this with you. And, dear listeners, if you're listening and you're like, I love all of this and books are not my thing, do not fear, because Justine also has got 2 podcasts in the spirit of doing all the things.
Well, so we completed the Starship Therapise podcast. It has concluded, and we were very mindful about the conclusion. So we spend several episodes talking about how we're about to say goodbye.
Like proper therapists, really.
Proper therapists.
But there are like many, like over 80 episodes, I think.
Oh yeah,
right?
you can spend some time.
Yeah, you can spend some time with them. I feel like podcasts live forever, even when they're done. You know what I mean?
That's right.
Ways.
Yeah. And then Dark Side of the Mat is an investigative journalism podcast about the creeps, cults, and crimes that show up in the wellness and yoga industry. We put out episodes very sporadically because me and my co-host Kat both have too many jobs. But But there are a few apps on there, and they're delightful. And also, if you liked the sound of my voice today, I do the audiobooks. So
right.
if you're more of a listener than a sit down reader, you can hear this voice say comforting things to you for 10 hours.
Which would be great. Exactly. And I think even with Dark Side of the Mats, there's like over 20 episodes out. So there's still, like, if people haven't got into it, and like, that sounds really interesting, there's plenty of episodes out. And I get it. I've become much more regular, but I've had my moments. At one point during the pandemic, I was like, I have not released an episode for a year. Oh, how did that happen? Like,
Oops.
Oops.
Oh, well.
A year, what is time anymore? Now
Yeah,
it's on my
exactly.
calendar. I'm trying to release one every 2 weeks, and I've been very good this season. So we'll see how it goes. But so, yes, there are many ways of accessing your wisdom, whether it's books, audiobooks, electronic versions of your books, which also exist, the 2 existing podcasts, and probably will there be a Grieving Therapist podcast? I think it would be beautiful. I don't know, but
we're still trying to figure out what the Grieving Therapist will be. I very much would love to have a retreat type environment where we literally sit around the campfire and we literally draw maps. But that's right now, I need to focus on, I'm starting several new chapters of my life. So stay tuned.
Yes, and I know that you're in transition in a number of ways, but if people are local in Minnesota, you have a wonderful opportunity coming up, I think soon after this episode is released, for folks to hang out with you in person. Do you want to literally, well, I don't know if there's going to be a campfire because it's pretty hot at the moment up here, but, maybe more of metaphorical campfire.
No, there will be a literal campfire. So thank you for that setup.
You're welcome.
If you are local to the Twin Cities or want to travel to the Twin Cities on August 16th, me and my colleague Mari Appledorn are putting on an event called Camp Counselor, which is a full day workshop of nurturing community. So while there will be trainings and opportunities for CEUs, really the point is you get to radically nurture yourself in community. And the day is all about choice. Want to go to a session? Cool, go to the session. Want to go walk the labyrinth? Cool, go walk the labyrinth. Want to be in community with your fellows and sit on a bench? Great, take a nap, swim in the pool. There's so many options, and we'll be taking the lens of internal family systems and enhancing our not just self of the therapist, but our self energy of the therapist, so that we can return to our work feeling actually replenished rather than the way we typically feel at the end of a day of training. And so I would love to see folks there, and I will be moving out of the Twin Cities area very shortly afterwards. So I would love to meet people in person. Come on down to Camp Counselor. There are also really cute t-shirts.
It does sound so good. I'm hoping to make it. And if you're listening to this episode after that has happened, do not fear, because there are going to be all these opportunities for you to engage with Justine's material. And I'm sure that you'll be at kind of panels, at conventions and so on. And I'll put all of those kind of in the episode description as well. But is there a place where, if people are looking for you, for your books or podcasts, or to hire you, like, where should they go?
Yep. If folks want to follow me on social media, I am always delighted. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Mind Body Fandom, because I take a holistic approach to healing mind, body, and fandom. And then you can find more info about everything that I do at my website, JustineMastin.com.
Beautiful. Thank you, Justine. I feel like I could keep having this conversation, but I'm going to be respectful of your time. So I will ask you the question that I always ask all my guests. Is there anything that we have not talked about that you really were hoping to kind of touch on, or you were hoping to talk about?
No, this was such a delightful conversation. I feel like we traveled all through Middle Earth today. We we visited the elves, we visited the dwarves, we saw the eagles. I feel very complete. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, that's beautiful. I also feel like we went on a journey together and it was so fun. I was like, oh, I know. I was like, oh, maybe we should just have more conversations in depth around fandoms and gender, like specific fandoms and gender. That would be so fun. But thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you and I really appreciate your work, Justine.
Thank you. So good to see you.
And to you, dear Gender Stories listeners or watchers, for those of you who started watching on YouTube, take care of yourself and find ways to replenish your soul. And I'm really curious about what stories fire you up. So feel free to contact me and let me know. And maybe I can make sure that we talk about those stories in future episodes. And until next time, take care.